Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tuesdays with Torah. Tonight, we're going to look at really a classic take on this week's Torah reading brought to us by Professor Gottlieb Zornberg. She is looking at the interaction between two major concepts in Judaism. One is Shabbat, and the other is the Mishkan, the Tabernacle in the desert. So the Mishkan serves as a major center and a whole host of things. And Shabbat, of course, is perhaps the most important teaching about Jewish life in the Torah. And so we'll see what we come up with. First, we're going to start with our blessing, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvot Vitzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments. You cause us to find holiness in our lives through acknowledging a power greater than ourselves and saying, maybe I should do something better by accepting some commandedness. And particularly in this moment, by allowing us to focus our attention on the esek, the business of divrei Torah, of words or matters of Torah and instruction. And tonight we're going to start with a little bit from this week's Torah reading. This week's Torah reading is Vayakel Pikudei. It's a double parsha. Vayakel Pikudei are the last two parshiot in Shemot, in Exodus. And as such, they bring to a close what we might call the liberation narrative of the Torah, the formal time where Moses and the Israelites are leaving Egypt and entering into the desert. They are prelude to what could be called the next section of the Torah, Leviticus, Vayikra, which is a focus really on the laws as applied not just to everybody, but especially to the Levites, but often known as the priestly code, because the Levites were the priests of the time. And so this is a transitional moment. And we lead into this moment with these two concepts. And these two concepts start out here at the opening, the opening of the Parsha, with the words, Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. And Moses convoked the entirety of the witnessing, the whole Israelite community, Vayomer Alehem. So important words here. This first one, Vayakel, which is the name of the Parsha, for those of you who are familiar with a couple of concepts with regard to Jewish gatherings. Generally speaking, we talk about a Jewish gathering place, a synagogue, a temple, as three things: a community center, a Beit Kehila, a home, a house of gathering, a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer, and a Beit Midrash, a house of learning. And these key elements are historic, and we're going to welcome Barbara. Barbara, happy birthday, right? Is today your birthday, Barbara?
It is. Thank you very much. Yes, it is.
So welcome, the Parsha after your Bat Mitzvah Parsha. So very happy birthday.
Thank you.
So here we see Moses gathering, and we see, of course, that the nature of the gathering is the entirety of the group of Israel, Kol Adat B'nei Israel, all of those who bear witness. So this is, the big, a big announcement. And what is Moses announcing? Vayomer Alehem, and Moses says to them, Ela hadvarim asher tziva Adonai asot otam. These are the things which God commands us to do, commands you to do, in fact, not Moses, but you. Otam is Ya'al, as it were, said appropriately in the South without the apostrophe, right? Ya'al, as one single syllable. But this, by the way, as we go through this today, this verb, la'asot, to do, is the big deal. There are a lot of doings, right? We are accustomed to being commanded, a mitzvah. The command comes from here. That word is tzivah, which God commanded. And like we mentioned before, we in our blessing, la'asok b'divrei Torah, to engage in divarim, words or matters. So these are the words, the matters, which God has commanded y'all to do, says Moses to the Israelites. And hi, Phil. And here, Moses continues with the reiteration of a very important, one of our two big important concepts tonight. Sheshet yamim ta'aseh melacha, uvayom hashvi'i yiyeh lechem kodesh shabbaton l'Adonai. 6 days you will do melacha. Now it doesn't say avodah here. Avodah is a normal word for work. This is melacha. This is professional work, creative work. Our translators don't necessarily go into it. They say work up here and work up here, but melacha is a particular type of work. And we're going to talk about Rashi's comment here, which is going to be very interesting. On 6 days, work may be done. Moses precedes the commandment to make the tabernacle, the Mishkan, with the Sabbath commandment. And here is at the core of one of the things we're going to look at tonight, to let the Israelites know that the building of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, does not supersede the Sabbath. So Shabbat comes first because Shabbat takes precedence. All right, somebody asking a question. Oh, you're leaving your phone and using your computer now. Okay, good to see you, Barbara. All right, next. So we've got six days you should do melacha. You should do this professional thing, this work type thing. And on the 7th day, Kodesh Shabbat, Shabbaton, a holy Shabbat of Shabbaton, of ceasing for God. Everything that all that you do on it, anyone who does on it a malacha, yumat, will die. Yes, there's a death penalty for doing work on the Sabbath. And on top of that, an additional thing that we haven't heard before, lo tivaru eish bechol moshvotechem beyom haShabbat. Do not kindle a fire in all of your dwellings on the day of Shabbat. All right, so everybody's gathered, big public announcement, Shabbat, no professional work, no kindling fire, and you die if you don't do what I say. Pretty stark there. Moving on to the next page. Moses continues. Moses says, Vayomer Moshe el kol adat b'nei Yisrael lemor. And interesting, one of the things here that we see is the text is being very clear about to whom Moses is speaking. Moses said, this is exactly the same phrase that we saw above. This is Vayomer Moshe el kol adat b'nei Yisrael, to everybody, all the whole assembled people, which is exactly what is said here. Kol adat b'nei Yisrael. So Moses, same audience. Moses isn't going into a quieter voice to talk to a smaller group. This is the whole kit and caboodle continuing. And what does Moses say? Again, Zeh hadavar asher tziva Adonai lemor. This is the thing which God commands to you, saying, and then continues. Kechu me'itchem truma l'Adonai. Kol nadiv libo yeve'eha et truma Adonai zahav v'chesed. Yes, Larry.
What word is used in the Decalogue? Avodah or this other phrase?
This other word, melacha, also used in the Ten Commandments. do not do any melacha. If you want to see, I'm pretty sure, but let's not take the rabbi at my word. Let's make sure I'm not making this up. That would be terrible, right? Fortunately, it is possible to find all these things and share them without even having to make copies. In the past, I would be like, oh no, I don't have that copied for you. You asked me about a text that I don't have. But here we have, thank God for the internet. We have Safaria, which I will share so you can see where I'm looking at. Steve asked, a little off topic, but when do Shabbat loopholes start to get around all of these restrictions? We'll talk about that. Don't worry. We will have plenty to talk about with regard to Shabbat loopholes. That will be a big deal this evening. All right, here is Exodus chapter 20. So we're going back a number of weeks. And so here, the Decalogue, the 10 Utterances, the 10 Commandments, right? So we've got God spoke all these words saying, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. No other gods beside me. Don't make yourself a sculptured image, all that sort of stuff. Don't bow down to those gods. That's all commandment number 2. Don't swear falsely. Lo tisa et shem Adonai Elohecha. Commandment number 3. Zachor et yom haShabbat lekadsho. Remember the day of Shabbat and keep it holy. Sheshet yamim ta'avod. So here it uses both. This is even better, Larry. Thank you for the question. 6 days you shall work. The asita, again, asita is and do kol milachtecha, and all of your professional stuff. So it's got both words here, but it's emphasizing the melacha in the part that we're looking at. And Steve, your question about loopholes, first of all, before we go on, what is prohibited on Shabbat as far as we know before we go on right now in Exodus? Up until this point, Larry had us review the 10 utterances, so we know it says don't do any labor and don't labor and don't do any of these melachot, whatever they are, these professional work things. What else are we not supposed to do? Not supposed to gather manna, right? The big deal is not supposed to gather manna, but that's explicit. And we just learned that we're not supposed to kindle fire. What counts as work? If I think it's a lot of effort to raise my hand from the plate to my mouth, does that count as work? I'm not allowed to eat? Of course not. So work is productive work of some sort. So we have a whole question of what that definition is. That definition is about to happen, but it's going to happen according to rabbinic tradition, not according to what's explicit in the Torah. So what the 5 books of Moses says is work is up to us. We have no explanation of it. This parsha is going to give us the major categories of it. So up until this point, it is up for debate. It will still be up to debate. Where is the list of 39? We are hitting it right here, Bob. You got it. Hi, John. So here is the list of 39. We are about to get there. And this is the connection between between Shabbat and the Mishkan. Because we've just gotten these rules about Shabbat, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, just some. And suddenly God says, Moses says, this is the thing which God has commanded you, saying, take from all of you a truma, a donation for God. Everyone shall donate as their heart a donation of their heart. This is kol nadiv labo. Each this is same word used for volunteer in modern Hebrew, voluntary heart giving. Yiviecha et trumat Adonai. Bring forward a truma, a gift, a donation for God. What should they be? They should be zahav v'chesed, gold and silver. So precious stuff, not cheap stuff, good stuff. Furthermore, all this stuff. So we're not going to read it all because it's a lot, but you have the techelet and the argamon, the blue and the purple and the crimson yarns, the fine linens, the goat's hairs, all of this stuff, right? Some of it is for the ephod and the choshen. That's the ephod and the breastpiece, right? Some of it is for anointing oil and aromatic incense. And then let all among you who are skilled and make all that Adonai has commanded, which is et ha-mishkan, the tabernacle. So the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is this dwelling place. It has at its root the root shin kaf nun, which is the same root for the dwelling presence of God, the Shekhinah. That's where that comes from. It's the same root for neighborhood in modern Hebrew. I lived in a set of dorms called Shikunei Ha'elef, the dwelling places of the thousand, on Givat Ram, which is a big hill in Jerusalem, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They were constructed as temporary dorms in the 1960s, and they're still there today. So everything is temporary, but some stick around for longer than others. Not only are we making the Mishkan, we're making the Ark, right? We've got Et Ha'aron, for the Ark of the Covenant, and all the stuff inside. So this is what we're supposed to be giving for. And on top of it all, as we get to the end of this, we do everything that is asked. Look at the conclusion here. We've got all the furnishings, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, the service vestments, all of that sort of stuff. But verse 42 and verse 43 are worth reading because they are the end of this particular thing. Kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe ken asu. Again, we've got that thing asu, thus they did. So like all which God commanded to Moses, thus they did. They who? The Bnei Israel, et kol ha'avodah. Thus they did all of the work. Here we've got avodah, but just to make it the labor word as opposed to the other word, vayar Moshe, and Moses saw et kol ha'melacha, all of the professional work, the creative work, the hine asu, and thus they did, hine asu ota, and thus, and look, they did it. Ka'asher tziva Adonai, exactly like God commanded, ken asu, thus they did, vayvarech otam Moshe, and Moses blessed them. In the words of contemporary Jews, the capital campaign has been completed, and the building got built. Everybody put on a tuxedo and have a party. So here's where we are. Moses has raised all the money. There is a point in another place where, in fact, Moses says we have enough, stop bringing it all. Which again is the only time a Jewish organization has ever said stop giving. So that takes us to Aviva Gottlieb-Zornberg's, Professor Gottlieb-Zornberg's commentary on this. You have any questions before we move on to the commentary? All right. Now, just to put us in the right mindset, we have currently what we would identify as 39 categories of work. Each and every one of the work associated with the building of the tabernacle become a category of prohibited work for Shabbat. And it is the proximity, as you saw, of the commandment of Shabbat and the commandment to build the tabernacle that creates that association. So one of the key elements about Jewish reading of scripture is we don't do exactly what the scripture says, we do what we interpret the scripture to tell us to do over time. We have a progressive interpretive tradition. No one has ever been killed outside of the Torah for violating the Sabbath, even though it said so explicitly. We are not a death penalty people, and we have read into the Torah the principle that life matters so much that we make death penalties hard to enforce. So the question of loopholes, Steve, is not really the question. The question is, what principle is being upheld by the teaching? In other words, with all of these details, it is very easy to get swept away and say, somehow this detail matters more than the greater principle. Except that's not the way things work. In order for a rule to be helpful, useful, and society building, it must be in accord with a greater principle. A rule that contradicts that principle, like stoning people for violating the Sabbath, is not a good rule for the building of a successful society, because there's no mercy involved in there. Furthermore, it's a focus on a detail that is not at the heart of what the society is built around. The society may be built around the principle of Sabbath, but not killing people over that principle. So we'll continue to ask that question because it's a very relevant question. Which of these rules count as rules versus principles, and how do we deal with it? So here, this is Mishkan and Shabbat, alternative modalities. And then Professor Gottlieb Zornberg says, 2 principles. In the last section of Exodus, Moses transmits to the people God's instructions about building the Mishkan. In overwhelming detail, these instructions already spelled out in chapters 25 through 31. Remember, we got these spelled out before the golden calf incident a number of weeks ago. So, but here they get moved from however Moses and God talked about them to the public domain, right? So that's what Professor Gottlieb Zornberg says. They move into the public domain where previously they had been the burden and promise of God's dialogue with Moses. They are now conveyed to the people and translated into forms and materials. Finally, the elements are assembled and the Mishkan arises, a complex integrated space for God to dwell in. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. So this should sound familiar because a number of weeks ago we read this. The idea that God would be along for the ride, right? There's this concept that one of the things about this is we are going to bring Sinai with us. Steve says, I meant workarounds like Shabbat elevators or appliances, but in earlier incarnations where their slaves or servants to do work that was prohibited. Well, I'm sure you've heard of the offensive term Shabbos goy, right? The Shabbos goy is the person from another background who is not obligated to observe Shabbat, who does things like turn on lights and whatnot. Workarounds like Shabbos elevators or appliances. So what principle is being upheld, I would ask you, Steve, by the workaround? The principle is that Shabbat is supposed to be delightful. It's supposed to be a joy. And some of those joys include figuring out how to have a cup of tea on Saturday afternoon, which means keeping water relatively hot throughout the day. Some of those things include people like to travel. And if you're going to travel and be in a hotel for more than 6 days, you're going to have to be in a place where people are consolidated, and you're going to be in an elevator. Now, remember, part of the issue is whether or not using electricity violates Shabbat. So we have to go through all the stages by which rabbis in the 19th century, not rabbis in the 2nd century, decided that using electricity was a Shabbat violation. So that's already a new thing. So we have workarounds about technology that didn't exist in the Torah. So it's a whole nother story. Slaves and servants are not allowed to do work. You're not allowed to pay anybody to do work on Shabbat, right? It is supposed to be a Shabbat for the community. That's pretty explicit in the Torah. Larry says, perhaps melachot was used rather than avodah because of the relationship to the tabernacle. Absolutely. There's a sense that the work that is prohibited is this particular type of craftsmanship. The crafts and the creative arts of the Mishkan are what's being prohibited. However, it does say avodah, the regular labor, elsewhere also as the general term. So we end up with these two terms, and one of the questions we have is, how are they different? How are they the same? What is in fact being prohibited? So before Moses embarks on the repeated inventory of objects and materials, however, he urges on the people the sanctity of Shabbat, the Sabbath day. So this is what we read. These are the things that God has commanded you to do. On 6 days, work may be done, but on the 7th day, you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, holy to God. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. Okay, so that seems pretty clear. The question is, what does it mean? I already pointed us to Rashi's comment, which Professor Gottlieb Zornberg remarks is classic. 6 days. God prefaced the instructions about the Mishkan work with the warning about Shabbat to tell them that the Mishkan does not supersede Shabbat. So this is at the heart of our question. What holiness comes first? Right? Again, if we're talking about the designation of key principles, central principles to Judaism around which we are going to form the rules, we have holy space, we have holy time, which takes precedence. According to the way we have read this for thousands of years, holy time prevails over holy space and holy labor as well. So we don't get to say the work that we do is so holy that we get to ignore Shabbat. Remember also, one of my key senses of the Torah is that the crafting of the covenant between God and the Israelites is a way of saying no human can tell you to violate Shabbat either. That this is there is no oppressive regime that gets to overrule God's rule with regard to downtime. Also known as I like to call it, the first labor law. An intimate tension is set up between Shabbat and the Mishkan. Before even beginning to speak of the building work, it is necessary to articulate a kind of anti-Mishkan principle. One might indeed have thought that the Mishkan does displace Shabbat, that the crafts that go to create the holy space would continue through the weekly day of sacred time, since the word kadosh, holy, appears in both contexts. Holy Kodesh to God is the day, and let them make me a sanctuary, a mikdash, a holy place. The imperative of the Mishkan work might well have overridden the weekly pause of Shabbat. Not so, and therefore Moses speaks of Shabbat before the Mishkan work to counteract a perhaps natural hypothesis. Now, why would this be a natural hypothesis? Well, Professor Gottlieb Zornberg is going to lead us into the idea that there is a little bit of a habit of being overzealous in the pursuit of things by the Israelites. And that overzealousness, overzealotry, would lead them to pursue things even at the expense of other principles. And we see this even to this day, that we get involved in the minutia of something, and sometimes it distracts us from the bigger things going around us. So that tension between a task that we are in the middle of that consumes us And the whether or not we are actually pursuing a principle at the same time is not just an ancient Israelite issue. It's one that is with us to this day. In this matching of the Mishkan principle against the Shabbat principle, the tension is articulated most vividly through the midrashic play on the words. These are the things, right? So Elah HaDevarim, these are the things is what the midrash is going to talk about. These, as opposed to the singular form of the command to build the Mishkan. This is the thing. So we've got these are the things versus this is the thing, which is the Mishkan, which you're supposed to build, which is a singular thing. These are the things. So what's this tension? So it indicates, according to Professor Gottlieb Zornberg, a mode of plurality, a sense of the complexity of the work categories forbidden on Shabbat. Suddenly, Shabbat gets a lot of stuff, a lot of prohibitions that it didn't have before, by use of this phrase, these are the things. So a numerological count of the letters, Elah HaDevarim, produces 39. You wanted 39, Bob? There you got it. How do you get 39 from Elah HaDevarim? Because Elah HaDevarim, we can go back to the word if you care to know. So you can see it in the Hebrew. Is all the way back here. Here are the two words that Professor Gottlieb Zornberg is talking about. Elah HaDevarim. Aleph is 1. Lamed is 30, and Hey is 5. This first word has the numerical value of 36. And then how do we get to Devarim from there? In her footnote, she says that Aleph plus Lamed plus Hey is 36, added to Devarim, which means two things, means 38, and Ha is an extra 1. So 36 from the first word, Devarim, not counting up all the letters, but just saying two things, and add the letter Hey to get to 39. It's a stretch. It's absolutely, positively a stretch. This is a way of coming up with a number that you already have in mind. Just to let you know how much this is done, this is why I do not advocate using numerology to find absolute meaning in anything. Because if I have my conclusion in mind, I'll find the number to support the conclusion.
Doesn't Zornberg, whatever her
Aviva
title,
Zornberg, her professor.
Okay, doesn't she acknowledge what a stretch that is?
Absolutely.
What an artifice! I mean,
Yes.
it's almost ridiculous.
Yes.
And she needs to come up with a number, and she will find a way to
No.
number.
Okay, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg didn't come up with this number.
Okay.
This is a traditional Jewish number. Rashi knew about this number. This is the number of, so this is a way of connecting the number of categories of work that follow with this commandment, right? So we've got a number of categories of work that are going to follow that comes up to 39. Okay.
We'll find it hell or high water.
And well, no. So the 39 exists in the subsequent pages. When we go to these pages and we find all these things that they're supposed to do, that's 39. So how do you connect 39 to Shabbat? We connect 39 to Shabbat through this phrase. What they're doing is they're finding 39 in two separate places. We've got 39 types of work. We're saying that these 39 types of work are the prohibited types of work for Shabbat because those are the 39 types of work associated with the building of the Mishkan. And how do we know that? Well, we know it because they're next to each other, but we're going to come up with yet another way to prove it. And so this is like numerological icing on the cake, if that makes sense. And yes, it's like reverse engineering. And Larry says, Shabbat of complete rest, even over holy objects, is the essence of the invisible God, even before we needed to rely on an invisible God. That's correct. God over stuff. You've absolutely got it. But really what we're talking about is also time over stuff. The time allows us to, when we sanctify time, we take control over our lives in a way that says time and the way we spend it is more important than the stuff that we have. And there we end up with a fundamental principle. So don't get caught up on the numerological thing. It's just yet another thing.
Well, Rabbi, I promise to shut up. It's after this. It's just that it seems like such a contrivance. It's like we need to come up with 39 somewhere, and we will. And here's the way it works out.
Okay, so human society is a contrivance. How we justify the rules that allow us to get along is an argument for practicality. Most people don't want to have this conversation. They want the to-do list. What are the things I'm supposed to do, and what are the things I'm not supposed to do? What our scholars are doing is they are embedding in here a whole host of arguments for why you must do this if you're a skeptic. So the skeptic, right? Remember that the rabbis are accustomed to a level of argumentation where one of their teenagers comes back into the house on the Passover Seder and says, what does this all mean to you? How come you're doing this stupid thing? I've been out there talking to these other people who say the Exodus is bunk and all you need to do is believe in this guy Jesus, and you're sitting here doing all these rituals, and we're all hungry. Drink the wine, eat the matzah, let's be done already. Right? So that's the level of skepticism that the rabbis are dealing with. That's the identity of the wicked child at the Seder, is the one who comes in skeptically. So they layer through this any number of arguments. And let me tell you, what's really interesting in looking at the tradition with regard to Shabbat is they withhold themselves from making Shabbat more difficult. The rabbis of the Talmud are involved in this give and take where they basically say, we could make this harder. We could make this more restrictive, but they choose not to because they're in this balance between justifying the culture preserving separate identity. Part of the Shabbat ritual is it gets the community together for a day where the only people who are doing what Jews are doing are the people identified as Jews. And it's a way of creating a minority cohesion in a majority society that's doing other things with other principles involved. The ritual and the not doing is an excuse to have a cohesion about something valuable happening in that gathering. Going back to the idea that it's not just the gathering that works, it's the gathering and having something of value take place there. Or in the case of Shabbat, something of value that doesn't take place. By not working, we give value to the rest of the week. Shabbat and its restrictions become a rule of liberation from labor, a rule of liberation from achieving, a rule of liberation from acquiring. And as Larry said, placing God beyond stuff and reminding us that our connection to God goes beyond that as well. So the details become a way of transporting the community out of even the holiest of work, right? The Mishkan might be an excuse to do work on Shabbat. It's holy. You can't tell me not to do holy work. So they have to come up, so our commentators, starting in the Midrashic period in the 6th century BCE, 2,500, 2,600 years ago, are still coming up with this question of justifying all of this to protect the community. Skepticism is characterized as wickedness. No.
I beg your pardon, Rabbi. You said that the
Okay.
skeptical young men that came in and said, all you need to do is follow this Jesus guy. And then you described them as wicked, which is quite an adjective.
So, quoting the Passover Seder, the wicked child separates themselves from the project. They're not just skeptical, they are willing to tear down the whole thing. We are a bunch of skeptics. We are a bunch of stiff-necked people. We are argumentative. We are willing to go toe-to-toe about the details, but we have to be bought into the project. The wicked child undermines the very foundation of the project. Bob asks, what would or did God do when the Israelites did not kill folks for not observing the Sabbath? Oh, so we don't have that many examples of that, Bob. And remember, God doesn't get involved with the day-to-day running of the Israelite community in the Torah, right? God gives the laws and then says, go and do. God doesn't say, huh? How come you're not doing this thing? God moves very quickly out of the micromanagement role. At this, God will eventually be a much better delegator than God was in the Garden of Eden. But I want to keep this skepticism alive, John. Don't get the idea that we're not into the skepticism. The issue of the wicked child is really the person who is protesting the very nature of Judaism. Larry says, and in the context of the underlying freedom from slavery story, this says that we have not just to be freed from one master, Pharaoh, to another God. That's correct. We are creating a different type of relationship with the divine, who is not, in fact, punishing us left and right. Okay. In the Mishkan, all these kinds of labors are required, admired, integrated into an organic space, and the limitation is so stringent that it must preface the detailed specifications of the Mishkan work. On Shabbat, just these kinds of work in all their variety are forbidden. Indeed, the sages deduce that violation of each prohibition is punishable separately. That is, a range of work that in the Mishkan becomes unified by its sacred purpose is diffused on Shabbat into 39 separate taboos. I want just to clarify what she's saying here. In the Talmud, each separate labor done is its own violation of Shabbat. There's no collective, well, I was doing all these things together, that are normally part of construction. No, each lifting the hammer and pounding in a nail is one violation. Tearing cloth for the sake of sewing it is another violation. Sewing the cloth is another violation. Each of them become their own punishable violation according to Talmudic law later on. So, when John, when you're saying, when you understandably feel that somehow Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg is coming up with this, no. What we have is in fact 2,000 years of Jewish legal tradition that's come up with this, right? She is channeling the collective creation of Shabbat in a legal system according to the Talmud, which starts with the words of the Mishnah, which were first written down in the 2nd century, but reflect the oral conversation of the Jewish people for the 700 years prior to that. So this is not, she is giving us conclusions that were written along the way. Here it gets back to Larry's question. The point emerges clearly from the word melacha, which is work or craft, which is characteristically used for the creative activity invested in the Mishkan. This same melacha is forbidden on Shabbat. On 6 days, melacha may be done, but on the 7th day shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to God. Whoever does any melacha on it shall be put to death. The Talmud sharpens the point by asserting that only creative acts are forbidden on Shabbat, not destructive ones. And this is, of course, tied directly to the original Shabbat. Because Shabbat originally doesn't have anything to do with the Exodus. Shabbat is tied to God's creation and God's stopping creation. So we are modeling ourselves on divine behavior. God stops at the end of 6 days. We stop at the end of 6 days. What does God stop doing at the end of 6 days? Creating. What do we stop doing? Also creating. Yeah, Barbara.
So how is it that that tearing toilet paper is creative?
So, good question. And the answer is because tearing any type of cloth or material is part of the creative process for building things in the Mishkan. You can't create a new tapestry of some sort without tearing something in the beginning.
In other words, you have to use the whole roll.
No.
Okay, so that commercial is correct, right, John? The bears, you know, where they keep just unrolling the roll.
No, so the issue is, if you're really crazy about this particular one, you can pre-tear your toilet paper, or you can buy separate sheet toilet paper, or you can use one of these.
Another workaround.
Another workaround. We've got a lot of them. So John said, we are the chosen people. We dominate banking, diamonds, tactical desert warfare by ways of deception. Do we do so because of or despite our self-imposed restrictions on Shabbat? In our many contrivances of violations of Shabbat within the literal restrictions, do we not ridicule the entire body of Shabbat law? Good question. So first of all, Jews do well at a lot of things because when we try to figure something out and find an exception, we integrate the learning of it first. The example of this from my own life is Ginny used to say with regard to Reconstructionist rabbis that we learn all the rules before we change any of them. We have to have a full sense of the scope of the project before we muck around with the innards. Or as my father used to say, read the effing manual, right? If you're going to pick apart the insides of something, know how it all fits first. And so when we talk about thoroughness, you know, one of my favorite examples, which I'm sure Larry has heard probably half a dozen times at this point, is that there is a moderately well-known, whose name I've forgotten, of course, is Israeli pianist who effectively, creatively, and capably improvised on the Goldberg variations by Bach. And a critic listening to him said, it was like listening to Bach create new music. Because in order to do that, one needs to get Bach's style into one's own DNA, to improvise on Bach and still sound in the manner of Bach. And so we don't muck around, we muck around with Shabbat, not for the sake of finding workarounds, but for the sake of trying to preserve the spirit of Shabbat. So what's the debate on electricity? Talking about this in particular, the debate on electricity is not whether or not electricity is equivalent to fire. There is a lot of, you know, spurious, superficial criticism of Orthodox Jewry as if Orthodox Jews treat electricity as fire, as if they're not ignorant, as if they are ignorant of the nature of electricity being totally different from the nature of fire. The issue is using electricity on Shabbat changes the nature of Shabbat from some people's perspective. In other words, if I am able to do things on Shabbat that make Shabbat feel like the rest of the week, then the principle gets changed. So if I leave a light on a timer so that the light goes on after Shabbat has started, right? So we light candles at or before sundown. That's the formal beginning of the Sabbath. If people don't want to use electricity and they have a timer that allows the lights to go on so that they can go around their house without falling over, that seems like a good thing. And without leaving the lights on the whole time, because that seems wasteful. So they're trying to, in fact, observe the principle. Now, is it okay to read at night on Shabbat? Well, that's an interesting question. Is that changing the nature of Shabbat? Is reading or studying in the spirit of Shabbat? I would say yes. But that means that if I've got the light on next to my bed so I can read during Shabbat, do I get to turn it off? For me, turning off and turning on lights doesn't change the nature of Shabbat. So I'm okay with that. Some people say it does. Yes, Barbara.
So riding in a car or any other vehicle is forbidden because it really is the same as your ordinary day.
Because travel, too far travel is not a symbol of rest, right? We're not supposed to travel on Shabbat because there's a restriction on how far you should go. Because at a certain point, you're engaging in the labor of the work of travel, and it's not restful. So how could the conservative movement allow people to drive on Shabbat? They can allow people to drive on Shabbat providing they're driving to synagogue and providing they've made appropriate precautions ahead of time, like filling up on gas beforehand so that they don't have to go and buy gas on Shabbat. By the way, there is no formal prohibition against buying and selling on Shabbat. That's an add-on.
Oh.
It's not one of those 39 original malachot. It turns out that what's prohibited is carrying money. The carrying is prohibited, not the purchasing. In fact, and interestingly enough, Larry, as somebody who just came from a temple board meeting, you might want to bring this back. There is actually no violation whatsoever to the to talking about the business of the community on Shabbat. It turns out that, in fact, there are examples in the Talmud of rabbis getting together and absolutely positively talking about the business of the community on Shabbat. So
but nobody can take notes, right?
That's correct. Nobody can take notes because that would be creative, but you could theoretically record it.
But then you have to punch a button.
Or you could hire somebody to punch the button, or you could have somebody volunteer to and pay them afterwards. Or you could have, the clergy person who works for the community punch the button. So Bob asked, I thought that on the seventh day, God ceased work, which sounds to me like God was working on the seventh day and stopped before the day was up. No, so on the seventh day, on Erev Shabbat, God stopped from creating, not stopped from working. God ceased creating. What about using a debit or credit card? You are not carrying money. Yes, so there's the question, right? Does carrying a card count as carrying? So speaking of dodges and in and out of Shabbat law, so Steve, when Ginny and I lived in Jerusalem, obviously there are Shabbat elevators everywhere. Now, travel and carrying are allowed provided you do it in an eruv. What's an eruv? Larry's, yes. An eruv is an artificially crafted space that extends the area in which one is allowed to carry and travel. All of Jerusalem is an eruv. So Ginny and I used to walk to a movie theater called Cinematheque. And Cinematheque was a movie theater that had a membership card. So since we could carry the membership card, we weren't purchasing our tickets. And since the movie was going on anyway, like a Shabbat elevator, right? It's going up and down and we're just getting on. Is it a violation of Shabbat to go to Cinematheque on Shabbat in Jerusalem? We said no. What was a violation of Shabbat was going and getting drinks and dinner afterwards at the cafe next to Cinematheque, but that's another story. So to go back to John's question, because I think I really want to end on this point of skepticism. We are meant to be skeptics. We are meant to question this. Judaism is constructed around the argument. This give and take is meant to temper our extreme modes. We have a tendency to work too much, not because we are slaves to Pharaoh, but because we are slaves to other things in our lives. And so Judaism is offering us a principle here that says, figure out a way to have a Shabbat rhythm in our lives. Some people have to work on Friday night and Saturday. So how did they have Shabbat? Well, it turns out that one of the ironies of current Jewish existence is it's hard for somebody who cannot take off Friday night and Saturday to find a Jewish community that will help them have Shabbat, because there's no alternate. Interestingly enough, if one misses, if one is incapable of offering the Passover offering on the first night of Passover, or first day of Passover in biblical times, there is an alternate day. There's a second Passover a month later, where one could go to the temple and make another offering. But there's no alternate Shabbat. And Shabbat's an even holier holiday. So I wonder if we were to be a more compassionate, more graceful, more integrative people at a time when not all of us have the luxury of taking Friday afternoon through Saturday afternoon off, if we couldn't say, okay, for those of you who work weekends, let's create an alternate Shabbat sometime during the week.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be appropriate? Because we don't have, we don't have a unified schedule anymore. We have no blue laws that prevent people from working on our Sabbath or Christian Sabbath, right? There was a time where Jews were lost out because they lost out on one weekend day of being a merchant, right? If I couldn't sell on Saturdays and all the stores were closed and everybody was in church on Sundays, then I was a clothing merchant, then I was out of luck in selling to people, because Saturday was the big shopping day and the city forced us all to be closed on Sunday. In Israel, where the majority of the people are Jewish, the Jewish calendar is enforced, except it's not. There are more things open on Shabbat now than ever. Oh yeah, and buses run on Haifa on Shabbat. So it gets complicated, and when we and again on the question of skepticism, John, I think we need to continue to sort of ask our question: are we objecting to the entirety of the principle, or are we trying to advance the principle in its application to as many people as possible? Are we pushing for accessibility or eradication? The Passover wicked child question, and it's a terrible model, don't get me wrong. The 4 children model in the Passover Seder is an awful pedagogical model, but the response to the wicked child is terrible. It's bad parenting and it's bad teaching. However, the question is, how do we approach that person who has decided to exclude themselves, to take themselves out of the group project? How do we approach them? I've said before, I'm reading Adam Grant's new book called Think Again, about how to, and one of the things he talks about is that in debating, one of the most successful debaters in the world doesn't go point for point, toe to toe with people, but in fact figures out how to ask questions that affirm his opponent's perspective and say, yes, I hear that, that sounds right, and have you thought about this? And it turns out that approach to engaging people sways more people than listing off all of the reasons why a person is wrong. Okay, and Steve says, I think this relates to what I was trying to say last week. In being the last to be offered and then accept the Torah, we will always be having these conversations. Also, doesn't the concept of chosenness imply that as long as we keep the covenant? Well, I don't know about chosen, whether or not we choose or are chosen. I believe currently what makes us Jewish is that we all choose to be Jewish. That regardless of our status as the chosen people, we are the people who choose to continue to be Jewish. None of us has to do it. And therefore, when we participate in a covenant that we opt into, as Larry talked about before, we are on an anti-slavery platform. Everybody has the freedom to opt in. And once we opt in, we also have the freedom to question. So with that, I want to invite everybody, if you're available, we're gonna talk more Maimonides tomorrow. And next week I'm taking off. The Central Conference of American Rabbis is having their virtual convention. I want to make myself available for that. But I hope to reconvene 2 weeks, so 14 days from today, for Torah. And then I look forward to connecting with all of you again soon. And so thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi.
Thank
Shalom,
you, Rabbi.
everyone, especially Bob.